Hello everybody, this is Gregory with 5-Minute Catholic Apologetics and Living, where 5 minutes of your time may get you to the divine. Today we're going to talk about how to defend Catholic matrimony. Now before we begin, let's start with a prayer. Nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritui Sancti, Amen. Gloria Patri et Filio et Spiritui Sancto, secutor in principio et nunc et semper, et in saecula saeculorum. Amen. Now, why I air quotes Catholic matrimony is because Catholic matrimony can be very similar to other types of matrimony that you would find in the Orthodox faith or even in the Protestant faith. And what are we talking about Catholic matrimony? I think we're looking more of like the historical view of marriage in Christendom. Prior to the Victorian era, we didn't really marry for the pitter-patter of the heart. Oh, I like the way he looks at me, he has googly eyes, and I got these stirring in my loins, or whatever you want to call it. Let's get married. It wasn't like that. That was more of a recent innovation in the last 170 years or so. Before that, marriage was something that was seen to be indissoluble and permanent, with one partner, exclusive. But there were other factors, right? Community property, ensuring good bloodlines, and the proper propagation and education of children, the natural fruit of this marriage. So when I talk about Catholic matrimony, I'm talking about one man, one wife, typically marrying pretty young, sacramentally, receiving the graces that come from matrimony, and staying with that person until one of you dies. Now, this was the view of marriage in Christendom for the last 2,000 years. And really, if you look across all cultures, this was kind of the view of marriage. If you strip away like the sacramental graces and whatnot, marriage, you see this, some sort of bonding of one man, one woman in every culture, really since the beginning of time. The outliers of polygamy or something like you would see with homosexual unions in something like Sparta was never elevated to the view of marriage. Now, if we look at some stats, it's pretty daunting. If you look at 1970, 75% of men and women under the age of 29 were married. 75% under the age of 29, 18 to 29 were married. If you look at it now, under the age of 29, it's 20%. 20% are married. What have we seen in the last several decades? The rise of illegitimate kids. Right now in America, and you can really kind of correlate this out to the whole West, the majority of kids are born out of wedlock now. It's about 52% in the United States. In certain demographics in the United States, it's like 70%. We know that couples are eschewing marriage. We know this is kind of concomitant to them eschewing religion. We see the rise of the non-affiliated. We see the rise of, if they're going to get married, they're going to get married later. And also concomitant with that, you look at the decline of population. Paul Ehrlich wrote this kind of fundamental work back in 1968 called Population Time Bomb. And I remember even being in college in the early 90s and having to read this book. And it was all neo-Malthusian, the world's going to end, it's overpopulated, blah, blah, blah. None of that was true. In fact, we're going through a demographic nightmare. Replacement levels need to be 2.1 children for a man and a woman. And everywhere in the world, it's under 2. Some are as bad as Japan, like 1.2. We're about 1.6. Latin America's 1.8. The only places where you don't see that is going to be sub-Saharan Africa and some parts of Asia. So you see these daunting stats, and I think some of these daunting stats exist because not only because of the decline of marriage, but the rise of the welfare state. If you think about 100, 200 years ago, if a woman had a child outside of wedlock, she didn't really have a lot of recourse, maybe going to a church, something like that, or a church-related mission service. But as a whole, there were deterrents that were involved to prevent this kind of reckless behavior. But now, if anything, we have an inducement with the welfare state where, in fact, you'll get money, and in fact, even more money if you have more kids out of wedlock. And then if you really combat and you augment that with the last 30 years of just the sex positive movement and the sexual revolution going back to the late 60s, I think there is a certain segment of the Gen Z population and the young millennials that realize that they were sold a bill of goods. Now, I can say for the Generation X, my generation, I don't know, unless you're religious, I don't know if my generation has seen it. We were raised on Sex and the City and that stuff that glorified that kind of lifestyle. But I honestly think there's this pendulum swing. And we've talked about in general in the American church how Pope Benedict predicted that the church would be leaner, but it would be more energetic, and the lukewarm Catholics, as Christ says, he spits out the lukewarm, as he mentions in Revelation. They'll leave or they'll die off, and I do think there is a young cadre of Catholics that realize that what we've been sold in the materialistic, secular, postmodernist world is actually not good for us. If you look at the statistics, the amount of poverty that happens with out of wedlock and children and living in cohabitation, and if you look at the studies that show that couples that don't cohabit actually have a lower rate of divorce, couples that don't contracept, artificial contraception I should say, have a much lower rate of divorce. And I think intuitively, especially the women, I think intuitively see that sleeping indiscriminately with men, as you see glorified in like the HBO show Girls or Sex and the City and a host of shows, actually is not good for my mental health. It actually worsens my mood, elevates depression and anxiety and all these other issues. So I do think you see this kind of return to, I don't know, like the shows I watched as a kid, Little House on the Prairie, The Waltons, and going back to this, you know what? Our forefathers did it this way. Maybe it's smart to do it this way. So where I live here in New Braunfels, there's actually a pretty sizable, I guess you could call it traditional Catholic community. And nearby, over at Texas A&M, there's a very vibrant college Catholic environment. Nearby, Texas State is also another one. Like I went to a Catholic in name only, small Catholic college in the state of Texas, and I would not say that they are kind of the hotbed of trad Cathism, but there are places, and so I'll see in my parish young couples, I mean like mid to lower 20s, getting married and starting families. There's several groups here in New Braunfels of women that kind of convene and get together to support one another, and it's just a lot of very young mothers in traditional marriages. And I do think that you see this now. Is this like emblematic of the entire United States general population from 18 to 30? No. I still think that a lot of people haven't gotten the update about how living a licentious lifestyle is actually bad for them, and it's bad for society, and it's bad for the population, as we've talked about population decline. But I do think that there is an intuitive sense that one man, one woman, marrying young, starting kids young, there's something primordially right about it. And I do think there is going to be this beacon call, especially to religious, not just Catholic, but just religious people who are going to forsake the lies that the devil's given us the last 30, 40 years about artificial contraception and all the fruit. Think of how present Paul VI was with Humana Vitae over 50 years ago. How the lies of just free sex and the fruits that came out of it, which was abortion and now IVF and all these horrors. I think they're realizing all this was horrifically bad for our society, and they're looking at their parents, their extended family, their grandparents, and seeing how a lot of these generations, my generations, are just broken. And I think there's this primordial return to traditional Catholicism and the trappings of the old view of sacramental marriage. Now we have a playlist here on dating and Catholic matrimony. If you want to check it out, I'll put a banner up here. But I am somewhat hopeful, but I'm also not some Pollyanna, to use a reference from my generation, to think that the typical 23-year-old college kid in some secular state university feels this way. But I do think that in general, the current of our culture is swinging back to traditional values. Guys, post in the comments. I'd like to hear from you if you agree or disagree. Until next time, take care. God bless.